Thank you, Andrew, and thanks very much for coming out today. My parents were from small towns in Queensland, so I have an enormous respect for people in communities and how communities come together. So a wonderful festival, and it's a real privilege to be asked to be here. And because we're in a classroom, at the end of the talk I'm going to ask you questions, and so I hope you can manage to pay attention. Okay, so one of the many different things that we do is work on biodiversity on farms, and part of that biodiversity is looking at paddock trees. So that's really the theme of the next 30 minutes or so. And so I wanted to give a little bit of background to what I'm going to talk about, then talk about some of the ecological roles of paddock trees with some occasional digressions. I'm allowed to do that now that I'm old and blonde. I'm going to talk about some of the threats to paddock trees, and then some of the management aspects of them, including, again, some digressions, and then a few new projects around paddock trees, including some thinking about AI and some inspiration from some work on, of all things, wildebeest and counting wildebeest. So we'll come to that. So I think it's pretty clear that there's the notion of paddock trees are really deep in our culture and our psyche. This is from the Southwest Slopes area in New South Wales where we work, and it's not unlike, for example, some of the things that I saw on Andrew's farm and many other farms yesterday. And we also know that paddock trees, or very large trees, are very deep in First Nations culture and First Nations psyche. This is a sacred tree not far from where we are at the moment. We have birthing trees on a number of our long-term farms that we work on, and there's a whole range of other deeper aspects to the psyche of trees in First Nations communities, but they're also really important, as we saw last night with that amazing art show, in our own culture, in our Western culture, and also more recently this notion of the connection in terms of the mental health of people in rural Australia and their connection to paddock trees and large trees. I also think that it's important to recognise that this notion of paddock trees is not just something Australian. This is actually from Romania, where they have a really deep culture of veteran trees and what they call pasture landscapes. And they've now implemented laws to protect these big trees with enormous community support and new legislation that's documenting some of these trees well over 1,000 years old in some cases. And then in other places, this is the Dehesa in Spain, and these are really important environments now protected under the EU Habitat Directive, and they have a whole range of interesting backgrounds, including scattered cork plantations, which are really important for things like Iberian lynx, which occur virtually nowhere else except in these scattered tree landscapes. And so we've looked globally at the literature on this, and Australia features around about here in terms of the number of publications around scattered paddock trees, particularly from this part of the world. So this is really documenting where the work's done on paddock trees across the world, and then looking at the different topics associated with the science, the body of science.
So the big one is Spain.
The big one is Spain and Portugal, because it's such an integral part of their culture and their biodiversity. Okay, so a little bit of background to the ANU research. As Andrew said, we've spent a lot of time stitching together the funding to keep long-term projects going. It takes about 25 hours of each of my weeks to keep that connected and keep things going. Australia does some things reasonably well in the long term, arguably superannuation. It does environment things really badly. And that's a real problem when you think about how much our environment varies from year to year. We have the most variable stream flows. It's the most hyper-variable place on the planet, which means you need to do long-term research to see things changing, but we almost do no long-term research in the environment space, which often means we don't understand how effective our management interventions are without those kinds of data. So this is a little bit of background to some of the long-term work we do, environmental stewardship work that now goes up into Queensland, Tasmania and Western Australia and elsewhere. So this is part of the federal government's nature repair market. How does it work? Is it working? You need the monitoring to be able to tell if it's valid. We have a long-term grazing study here in New South Wales. Other work associated with restoration down into Victoria, box gum woodlands, the Western Murray program, looking at their incentive scheme. This is tall wet forest, which is not really relevant to today, and also the Jervis Bay Fire Study at Buddaree National Park. So there's over 1,000 sites, long-term sites, where we gather long-term data. And in the context of our work on farms, we look at a whole range of different what we call natural assets on farms. So that ranges from tree plantings, enhanced remnants with understory planting, protecting waterway areas, mixed farming landscapes in most cases. And the last one here we're going to talk about today is remnant paddock trees. And I think it's one of those kinds of natural assets that often has fallen off the radar, yet I think is really very, very important. So the biodiversity data that we collect on these sites, and I'm just giving you a bit of background so that you can see where some of our management recommendations are coming from later on in the talk. We look at things like plant species richness, the structure of the vegetation, numbers of trees, then a range of different animal groups, which is now expanding to include some of the macro and micro invertebrates in farm dams, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then some of the attributes of the vegetation, whether it's bare ground, hollow trees, rocky areas are turning out to be really important micro hotspots for many species. So that's some of the data that goes with these 1,000 plus long-term sites. And so we look at a whole range of things to do with old growth woodland, farm dams, rocky outcrops. Today we're going to look at mostly at paddock trees, and we look at things at different scales. So at the planting scale, at the individual tree level, but then at the farm level, and then at the landscape level. So we need to think about how things operate at these different scales, because they actually interact, and interact in interesting ways. Okay, so we know that large old trees, paddock trees, have lots of ecological roles. And we can document them in these little simple schematics ranging from the large number of seeds that they produce. Big trees do things differently to humans. Humans have their babies at a certain stage in life. There's a juvenile period, then we have our babies, and there's a long period, sadly, of senescence. I think we're all aware of that. Trees do it differently. As trees slow in their growing patterns, they tend to produce more seeds. They direct more of their energy into reproduction as time goes on. So their lifestyles are quite different to ours. And that has a big effect on things like the number of flowers, the numbers of seeds, nectar production, all those kinds of things, which is why really big trees in the landscape are so important. And then there's a whole lot of things going on underneath the ground, which are also really important in terms of carbon storage, soil nutrients and the like. And we can see those conveyed into their roles, for example, as stepping stones for animals moving across the landscape, and different habitats that we see in these really big trees as these trees grow and change in quite important ways. So stepping stones and connectivity, we've actually looked at this in quite some detail about how animals move across landscapes, the gaps between trees that are important for some animals like gliders which won't move once tree spacing gets beyond about 70 metres. But we also see what happens when some of these bird species in particular move across the landscape and the direction of movement relative to where the trees are. So if you are interested in any of these kinds of things, I'll leave my email address at the end of the talk, and you can send me an email. I do respond, and I will send you the paper. I don't respond to hate mail. I get a lot of that, but I seriously do. But I probably won't respond if you send me some nasty things. Nesting habitat, this is very close to where I live. Wedge-tailed eagles are clearly picking out two or three large trees that they nest in sequential years, and you can see the results in terms of numbers of nestlings produced, those kinds of things. And then foraging habitat, really quite important in terms of the age of the tree, the number of flowers produced, the numbers of things that are associated with trees, big trees, and the level of interspecies competition that declines as time goes on, the bigger the tree gets. And there's a whole area of work that we're doing at the moment called mixed feeding flocks. It's where bird species group together, different thornbills, weebills, all kinds of things get together, and forage together because they can benefit from things that other species can't eat, but they can. And then they tell each other about alarm calls as well, so what predators are going over. So it's called a mixed feeding flock. It's a pretty cool piece of way that the pardalotes, the thornbills and other species get together. And then all these very important structures in moderation. You get too much mistletoe in some of the box gum and then the tree dies. But without mistletoe, then we miss out on a whole range of other species. So it's an important microhabitat. And there's now a whole body of work around what's called TREMS, tree-related microhabitats. And they're pretty cool. It's not something that's been looked at in Australia, but of course the Europeans have done this to death. And then we also see that there's very strong relationships between species richness of birds, for example, and the number of large logs on the ground under woodland trees and elsewhere. And we can come back and talk about that at some other stage. But there are these links with microhabitats and biodiversity that are really very important. And then, of course, many people will be aware of the production roles of large old trees, particularly shade for livestock and boosted lambing success. You see there's a typo from this morning. Sorry about that. Soil stabilisation. Well, Andrew asked me to shrink the talk, so I went through, but at 6 o'clock this morning, I wasn't really awake as I should be. Some interesting work on soil stabilisation. That's not ours, that's other people who have been looking at that. What we have been looking at is shading, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So again, we can think about the different roles that these big trees have in the landscape, disproportionate to their extent. So these trees often have really important roles, even though they're a relatively small part of the environment. So we call them keystone structures because of all these different roles, whether they're low cost for natural regeneration, shade for farm dams, shade for livestock. So here's a great example of a shading role. This actually comes from Tasmania, and I think it illustrates some of the issues when there's over-clearing in terms of its relationships with livestock and livestock weight gain. So there is some very good work showing that relationship quite clearly in terms of exposure and effect. And we often talk about these things on our farm days, and we suggest to someone, have a think about what it might be like to be a mammal in the forest, and then maybe take all your clothes off and take off your hat and then stand out there for a while and just have a think about what it might be like first thing in the morning, like this morning. And then when it's 46 degrees, as it was, Andrew was telling me about recently. So the shading thing is actually very important for livestock production, and you can see that in the data that people have been publishing. One of the things that hasn't been published, which someone in our group is looking at from an economic perspective and a biophysical perspective, and this work is in review, but it's not yet published. Where there's appropriate shading around farm dams, we see about a 33% reduction in rates of evaporation, which means a highly significant change in water persistence times. It's obvious, but it's not documented properly yet. But the more shading you have, the longer your water stays there for. The longer your water's there for, the better your outcome in terms. We can come back to a question at the end in a moment. Yeah. So this is part of some work that we started almost a decade ago. And we're looking at farm dams, and we're comparing control farm dams which have had no management intervention versus ones that are changing the way that they're managed through to an enhanced farm dam. And then we've got another external control, which is a natural water body. So this encompasses over 130 dams now. And what's involved in many cases is a microplanting around the dam with a fence, and then shading in appropriate areas, often a hardened water access point where animals come in to drink and then move back out into the paddocks, so you reduce the amount of bogging that takes place. The tussocks are interesting because we often see small and medium-sized reptiles in these kinds of areas, and they're consuming things like snails, which are then of course, part of the life cycle for liver flukes and other animals. And we've seen remarkable changes in the quality of the water, which is documented in terms of changes in salinity, turbidity, and other things. Fecal coliforms drop dramatically, very quickly. So if people are interested in how things change, please send me an email and we'll send you out some information about this process. We can see in a Victorian context with moderate levels of rainfall that you get about a 3-to-1 benefit cost ratio for the investment in doing this in terms of water quality and weight gain. Who would have thought that drinking high quality water would actually lead to extra weight gain? I suppose the Romans have only known that for a couple of thousand years. Meat and Livestock Australia basically don't have any information on this. It's quite remarkable when you think about it. And so the other thing that's really quite extraordinary, this is a partnership with Deakin University and then now RMIT University because their group moved. Farm dams in poor condition produce enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. The equivalent, a small farm dam produces the equivalent greenhouse gas emissions of a small car fleet. So when you fence a farm dam and you change its condition, remembering that there's 1.765 million farm dams in Australia and about 97% of them are in poor condition. So the greenhouse gas profile has been estimated to be similar to the landfill gas sector. So when you fence a dam, you see a 74% reduction in methane fluxes, 124% in carbon fluxes, and a 96% decrease in carbon dioxide equivalent. So fencing the farm dams, for example, in southwest slopes of New South Wales is equivalent to taking all the cars off the road in Wodonga and Albury. It's really quite remarkable. And our sense is here that if we were to encourage farmers to be able to do those fencing programs, that should be allowable under the carbon methodologies to assist this process. But there's a biodiversity outcome which is really quite remarkable. So we started to see huge changes in the amphibian fauna and things that we had no idea even existed. Freshwater sponges. Who knew that there was such a thing? And these changes take place very quickly, often within a couple of years of these investments, which is really quite fantastic. So Martina Malerba, who's been leading this work in our partnership, he's now at RMIT University, so this is an ANU RMIT connection. He's looked at this process, the mechanisms. He's invented machines to be able to record the greenhouse gas emissions off the surface of the dam. It's remarkable. It's a good news story. And we also know that if we swap gears here now, thinking about large old trees as point nodes for natural regeneration, we have all seen that. And the cost effectiveness of that is significant relative to having to do direct planting. So if we move now to the key threats, obviously land clearing is one of those, including split pivot agriculture. Another one is plantation establishment in places. And we see this in southern New South Wales. And all of these you'll be familiar with. Some is not, and that is the ageing population of big old trees with no recruitment or replacement. But there are good solutions to that too. And we can see how these things connect up. Climate change affects fire regimes, climate change affects insect attacks. Paddock tree decline is all connected to how these things fit together. And that's one of the major problems in the environment is things interact. And when you've got to deal with multiple things interacting, that's when you really start to get into trouble. So we're all familiar with these kinds of images from a couple of hundred years ago, still occurring in places, sadly. This one is continuing to be an emerging issue. This is from the Tumut region, where we see extensive losses of paddock trees, many thousand trees in this case. This was prior to our establishment of a big project in 1997 looking at the effects of plantation establishment. We can talk about that another time. That project's still going. Firewood collection is a big issue still, and its impacts. Another one is prescribed fire, and that really is an important issue. Andrew and I were talking about this yesterday, particularly in terms of extended root systems and the potential to bring fire back into the tree itself. Another one is wildfire, and the impacts of wildfire. These tend to be pulse disturbances, and it is possible to study them. This was one of our PhD students looking at a nearly 20% decline in paddock trees associated with a single fire in the southwest slopes. And that was relative to an unburnt control, still a high rate of loss of 5% of paddock trees. So we can see the potential for these events to cause major losses in a very short period of time. And this is Mason's paper in Austral Ecology, Mason Crane, looking at this effect of fire on scattered paddock trees. So that kind of indicates we've got to think carefully about not only fire in the landscape, but the recruitment process to replace what we're losing. And issues right through parts of southeastern Australia are to do with secondary salinity and tree death associated with that, particularly when trees start to get their roots into a salty water table. Okay, some of the management issues then that are a counter to some of those threats. So I think from what we've seen in our own work is there is a need to think carefully about how you're doing hazard reduction burning. We could do a whole gig on fire. Maybe we'll do that another time. I think there's a need to think about intensive grazing right around these trees, particularly because of the extra nutrient input, which seems to trigger problems with dieback. Australian trees generally aren't geared towards dealing with high nutrient loads. That's not how they evolved. Firewood collection, sorry, there's another typo there at 6 o'clock in the morning. Limit firewood collection, I think, is also very important because the dead trees continue to be very important in the landscape for a lot of species. Natural plantings around paddock trees is important, and I see quite a difference between plantations and natural plantings, particularly in terms of water use. And in the case of exotic plantations, I do think we need to think about buffers around those big trees if we're going to maintain that savanna-like landscape. And as part of that, I think it's important to think about farm planning. What are the natural assets that you've got on your farm? Where are the paddock trees? Where are the farm dams? Where are the rocky outcrops? Where are the areas of existing remnant vegetation, the areas of native grassland? And so there's quite a mapping exercise, and it sounds very simple, but we've been surprised in our dealings with well over 350 farmers across our long-term sites, how few people really think through some of these things in terms of their next farm plans. And then thinking about that, for example, in relation to paddock trees. So understanding that many people want to do cropping of various types and mixed cropping and grazing, where might they do their fencing, including micro-fencing. And this is part of rethinking what a scattered paddock tree landscape might look like in the future. So not only consolidated plantings, but individual plantings and then around waterways and the like. So you're reducing the effect on your managed area, but maximising the benefit of any fencing or changing and grazing regimes that you might want to implement. And what we've discovered in these box gum systems is that paddock trees associated with plantings seem to do better in terms of condition. And whether that's because they're with their friends or whether there's a change in grazing regime or a combination of both, it's quite interesting. What we do also see is a really major boost in bird biodiversity. And that's because we're adding two ages of vegetation together in the one place. So we end up with a multi-age woodland where we see the highest bird species richness. And there's a whole bunch of biology associated with multiple layers of vegetation, multiple niches, multiple bird species, and then other outcomes that come with that. This idea of co-located assets. So what we see in terms of the benefits of paddock trees and the benefits of managed farm dams is that when we put these natural assets together, we get 1 and 1 equals at least 3.5 and sometimes even more. And so there's benefits to the trees, there's benefits to the dam, there's benefits to the water quality. And so we documented that through one of our PhD student studies just a couple of years ago. And it's really quite satisfying to see that. And many of our landowners are responding really strongly. It's quite exciting for them to see the management interventions that they've put together, but then also the dividends, the biodiversity dividends, but also the productivity dividends that are coming from that. So one of the things associated with land care in this kind of broader theme is that there's often disparate plantings in different parts of the landscape. So farmer Wendy does some great plantings on her place, farmer Andrew does some great plantings on his place, farmer Bill does some interesting work on another place. We've seen the effect at the site level where the planting is, but what happens across broader landscapes? And what we've been able to do now, and this is a demonstration region at Holbrook, is to see the cumulative benefits across multiple farms throughout a landscape as a result of all the work that's been done in land care in that region. So we've seen the change in woody cover go from about 15% to about 22.5% in that period from 1992 onwards. A lot of the gain is through plantings, so very active land care, which is wonderful to see. And what we see is, for an example of 5 species, all threatened species in this case, is that 3 of them have increased quite dramatically. 2 of them are continuing to decline, but the decline is slower than it would have been if there hadn't have been a lot of work from land care. So over the whole landscape, positive trends for 3 species, negative for 2 species, but things are significantly less worse than they would have been if there hadn't been a lot of exercise around the planting space. So that's compared to a counterfactual if there'd been no land care and no plantings since 1992. And that's actually really hard to do, to put together this cumulative effect of all the combined work on different farms over different years. It's not easy to pull that together. And we've also got now quite a number of farmers that are doing micro plantings at the level of a single tree to try to replicate this idea of a scattered savanna-like landscape across their farms. So these tree guards are quite important, and they are movable once trees really get going. One of the interesting things is, and there's always insights from landowners about some of the things that do and don't work. So this is work done by John Baker from the Hovels Creek Land Care Group. Really interesting farmer, really innovative. And John's been looking at which single plantings in his paddock tree landscapes that he's recreating seem to work. And of course, the innovation is really interesting in a practical context. He gets worried about J rooting, where the feedstock, the planting stock, doesn't seem to work nearly as well. So he does a lot of work to think about this and the whole pot process and the like. So, really interesting innovation to solve some of these problems to boost the success, all the work of putting trees in the landscape. So I'm just going to finish up with some other little touch-on points and some of the things that are still going. That's why we want to keep this long-term work going, not just for the sake of monitoring, but some of the other insights that come with this. We're going to look at new kinds of hollows, environmental accounting, some paddock tree monitoring, and a bit of a synthesis. So from 2008 to 2023, we did a lot of work on nest boxes. People love to put up nest boxes, and we looked at nest boxes in plantings, nest boxes between remnants and plantings, and nest boxes as an offset for the widening of the Hume Highway. This is a rather sad one, and we won't talk about that too much. What we've discovered is that nest boxes probably have some of the highest densities of exotic bee populations anywhere in the world. What we discovered from the expansion of the Hume Highway was that we managed to move populations of starlings and Indian miners into places that they hadn't been before. And this is in the game that I used to play. That's called an own goal. So there was a lot of thinking about what was actually going on, looking at literally thousands of nest boxes, and what was actually happening with the process of the Hume Highway offset in particular was that we added common brush-tailed possums and ring-tailed possums, so we were mostly increasing things that were already common. So really the conclusion there was think about a tailored design for the species that you want and a tailored design against the species that you don't want. They're different things. And so there was a lot of thinking there. And the offset issue of clearing literally thousands of paddock trees was that we got more bees and more starlings by putting up nest boxes that had mostly fallen off within the first 2 years. So we also then have started to think about alternative ways to create hollows, looking at the tree carving process and putting in these carved hollows. And there's a process in science, it's called the hype process. So the beginning begins with, wow, this is fantastic, the latest new thing. And it is pretty cool. We do see some interesting animals, but we also see that trees do their own thing and they decide, I'm not really interested in having a hollow in me just yet. And then they grow over. And so the ability for carved hollows to really get us to where we need to get to, I think, needs a bit more thought. Environmental accounts. So this is interesting. This comes from the United Nations, and what we're doing is thinking about the combined value of these different natural assets in the landscape. And there's actually a formal process for doing that now. And we've been doing this through Michael Varden and others at the Fenner School in the box gum areas. We've done it in forests, but now moving into these agricultural landscapes, thinking about paddock trees in the context of some of these other values in contributing to directly and indirectly to a farming enterprise. And then working with people that have been on the land for a long time and solved some really serious economic issues and financial issues on their own farms. So this is John Mitchell, the lead author. He's Aileen Mitchell's son of Silver Brumby fame, and he has recovered his farm from financial catastrophe not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so he's got some really interesting insights into solving some of those problems. So my thinking was, let's tell the story, John. Let's tell people about how we tackle some of those issues. And more recently, we've been looking at using AI to track what's happening with paddock trees. It's based on some technology that was used to document the numbers of wildebeest in South Africa. And so it's interesting looking at Airbus satellite technology and at different levels of resolution and how we can tease apart if we're dealing with 5 trees or 1 tree, and looking at counts over time and then fitting the model to go back over time. And most recently, John Baker, who was the person who was looking at the J-root issue in the Hovels Creek area, asked us to start to pull all this together. So this is a book that's coming out in a couple of months' time. This was in response to people asking us about how we might better manage paddock trees, which means that people are thinking about these issues and wanting to do something about it. So I'm going to leave it there. There's my email address. Like I said, happy to respond if you want to follow up something on farm dams or other things. Please send me an email. But if you can reduce the hate mail, that'd be great. I get enough of that as it is. Thank you very much.